Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager at the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 1 webinars, presented on the second Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about the series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. And now a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker for today. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa History page of YouTube in a few days. I disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Andrew Klump is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not be able to get to all the questions. And also, a few days following the program, a thank you email will be sent, which includes a list of additional reading and resources for you to peruse and explore the topic even further. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Sara Catterall. Sara Catterall is a writer with a drama degree from NYU and an MLIS from Syracuse University. She was born in Ankara and grew up in South Minneapolis. She has worked as a librarian at Cornell University, as a reviewer and an interviewer for Shelf Awareness, and as a professional book indexer. Her work has been published in the NEH's Humanities Magazine and the Sun Magazine, and she co-authored Ottoman Dress and Design in the West, a visual history of cultural exchange. She serves on the executive board of Buffalo Street Books in Ithaca, New York, and is a member of Biographers International. And now I'm happy to turn it to Sara to begin today's webinar.
Welcome. I'm delighted to be here with you to talk about my biography of Amelia Bloomer and her many years in Council Bluffs, Iowa. To begin, though she spent most of her life in Council Bluffs, I'll talk a bit about her origins in New York State and how she became unintentionally famous. I first became interested in Amelia Bloomer while I was working on an earlier book that I co-authored, Ottoman Dress and Design in the West. I was intrigued by a passage that argued that in the 18th century, women's rights advocates, radicals, artists, and alternative health institutions in Europe adopted the dress of Ottoman Turkish women, in part because they admired their greater legal rights and freedoms. The book included this engraving of Amelia Bloomer in a version of that dress, reproduced in a German newspaper of the 1850s. I started to wonder who she was, why this dress became so famous even in Europe, and if there was more to her story. Everything I read about her intrigued me more. Her first political newspaper for women, called The Lily, her connections with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Frederick Douglass, her job as a post office deputy, her reading room for women in Seneca Falls, and her career as a public speaker and in the leadership of state and national organizations, both in New York and after her move to the Western frontier in Iowa. And then I read her writing, and she was so bold and sarcastic and with such a clear voice, not at all what I expected. At first, I thought maybe I could write a long essay about her, and then as I found more material, maybe a 200-page book. I ended up with 700 pages of material, and I had to cut it down by 2/3. I'd like to share some of the history I learned along the way. We hear a lot about the generation of suffragists that won the right to vote, with images of women like these in 1912. We hear much less about the earlier movement that they built on, that was organized before the Civil War. Amelia Bloomer began publishing The Lily, her newspaper for temperance and women's rights, in 1849. She was old enough to be some of these women's grandmother. Also, these women in 1912, despite their serious legal limitations, could take for granted freedoms and opportunities that were radical to even imagine in the 1840s, when Bloomer and Anthony and Stanton were starting out. In 1912, a woman could own property and go to college. She could become a doctor or a lawyer. They not only felt it was their right to speak their minds in public, they had many women role models who had written and spoken in the political sphere well before them, some of whom were their mentors. They were definitely still out of the mainstream, but they had also inherited an established movement that had developed over decades. This is an image of the stages of a woman's life from 1848, the year before Amelia Bloomer first published The Lily. It's not unusual for the time. The captions describe the ideal girl and woman as sweet and gentle, a flower, a clinging vine, which then bears fruit, after which she selflessly devotes herself to family and religion until she becomes a useless burden, waiting for death. Women were expected to spend most of their time at home and never to speak out loud in mixed company, including in church. Most were rarely educated. Married women had almost no legal rights. When Amelia Bloomer was born in 1818, women in the United States became the property of their husbands when they married and had no legal existence of their own. No rights of divorce, custody, or inheritance. They could not access higher education. In most states, they could not own property of any kind, or if they could, it was rare that they could control it. Any money a woman made belonged to the male head of her household. If they didn't get married, or the marriage broke down, or if their husband became sick or disabled or died, they could only hope their male relatives would support them. Even single women and widows could not work in any of the professions that paid well enough to support a family. Teaching, needlework, and domestic work were the main options, all of them underpaid. It's important to understand that at that time, this felt normal to everyone. Most people believed that women were physically and mentally weak and had to lean on men. Most women believed this about themselves. So if you disagreed at all, it was frightening to challenge this state of affairs. And the fear was not unreasonable. Any woman could be legally beaten by her male relatives. If her husband killed her, he might spend a few months in jail. If a woman was involved in a scandal, she could be rejected by respectable society, including her family. There was no government support and never enough private charity. The legal work open to women paid very little and often required her to have a good reputation. Her best paying option would be sex work. The average woman alone in the world was likely to end her life in severe poverty and a nasty death. The women who organized the early movement in the United States were raised in this environment. All the women pictured here were active before 1855. On the top row, left to right, are Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton with two of her sons, Sojourner Truth, and the Reverend Antoinette Brown. On the bottom row, left to right, are Abby Kelly Foster, Sarah Grimke, Angelina Grimke, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Lucy Stone. If they were Black, they also had to contend with living in a country that practiced chattel slavery and did not regard them as real women, even if they were free citizens in the North. In New York State, slavery was not abolished until about 1827, when Amelia Bloomer was 9 years old. Slavery was outlawed in Iowa when it became a state in 1846. For even a free woman to stand up for the rights of women took a lot of nerve and intense determination. It often also required some combination of status, money, and family or organizational support. Bloomer had the support and encouragement of her husband, but not much money or status. She first got involved in politics as a young rural village wife without inherited wealth or influential relatives. Like a lot of women at the time, she began her political involvement through temperance. Most women in the early women's rights movement started out in temperance and the abolition movement, which overlapped quite a lot. Bloomer was raised Presbyterian, and she was already committed to temperance as a teenager. The temperance movement in the United States took off after an epidemic of heavy drinking in the 19th century that was comparable to our opioid crisis now. Reformers blamed it on the big distilling companies and the taverns and rum shops that sold cheap hard liquor to the poor. Alcohol abuse was perceived as the primary cause of poverty and violence, including domestic violence. Temperance advocates argued that though some people were able to drink in moderation, social acceptance of alcohol and the social pressure to drink ensured that those who could become addicted or were vulnerable to relapse were doomed. They believed that if alcohol was banned, poverty and domestic abuse would go away. Since most women were completely dependent on the men of their families, and divorce was not a social or economic option for most of them, temperance became an acceptable cause for women to promote outside of the church in their roles as the moral guides of men and families. Abolitionism was on the rise at the same time, and it was common among Northern progressives to support both. I read one historian who said that the abolition of slavery initially felt like a somewhat safer cause than temperance for many white Northerners and their organizations because it didn't involve as much direct conflict with their immediate neighbors and relatives as temperance did. But even before the Fugitive Slave Act made it a felony to aid fugitives from slavery, abolitionism wasn't exactly safe either. To give some sense of the political atmosphere, here's an anecdote from Philadelphia, which was probably the most progressive city in the East when Amelia Bloomer was growing up. In the 1830s, it had become so difficult for abolitionists and other reformers to rent space in Philadelphia for their meetings, they built this hall for themselves as a temple of free discussion. Anti-abolitionists made plans to destroy it while it was still under construction. The first major event there was an abolitionist convention in 1838. Angelina Grimke gave a speech there as part of it. She was one of the first women to speak in public on abolitionism, and after she was condemned for that, she also started to speak on the rights of women. On the night she gave her lecture at this meeting, a mob showed up. They interrupted her speech, threw rocks through the windows, and screamed insults at the black and white women who left the meeting arm in arm for safety. The next day, the mayor canceled the rest of the convention to restore peace, and the mob broke into the empty hall and set it on fire. The city firefighters sprayed down the neighboring buildings and let the hall burn to the ground. Amelia Bloomer was 20 years old, and she almost certainly read about it. Bloomer was born in the central New York village of Homer in 1818, well before the Erie Canal. The original village is a historic district now, about 40 minutes from my house outside Ithaca. She was the fifth of 6 children. Her father owned a series of little water mills that processed wool cloth and pressed linseed oil. She called her childhood a masculine autocracy, and she said she owed what education she had to her strict Presbyterian mother, who believed that girls should be educated. While I was researching this book, I traveled around this region to some of the villages that Bloomer knew back then, and though I'm sure she would hardly recognize them, you can still see vestiges of the New York state she knew if you know where to look. Most of her homes and churches are gone, but Homer has a historic marker in front of her childhood home. The village green is still there. The oldest building in use there is the Episcopal Church, which was built several years after Bloomer's family moved away, but she would have seen it when she visited later on. This is a picture of Seneca Falls, not long after Amelia Bloomer lived there. I've seen a few writers describe Seneca Falls at that time as sleepy. It absolutely was not. It was a village of only about 3,000 people, but it was a rising industrial mill town with a lot of progressive politics. It was connected to the Erie Canal, and then the railroads to the east and west. You could get there from New York City or Boston in a day. A lot of recent immigrants and city speculators are doing a lot of business there. Touring shows and concerts and lecturers came through. And it was part of the burned-over district of central New York, which was called that because of the waves of religious fervor and creativity that went through this region in the early 19th century. So in some ways, this area of the state was more radical than the cities. Bloomer would comment when she spoke in New York City that the women there were more conservative than she was used to. Her husband was Dexter Chamberlain Bloomer, a young lawyer and co-editor of the newspaper in Seneca Falls, and he belonged to the volunteer fire department. He admired the letters that Amelia wrote to him during their courtship, and he thought she could become a professional writer. He had been raised a Quaker, which included the belief that men and women were spiritual equals. They had a remarkably respectful and mutually supportive marriage. Dexter wrote the only other full-length biography of her the year after she died, in an attempt to secure her legacy as a serious writer and activist. Bloomer started her influential newspaper, The Lily, as part of a women's temperance committee in Seneca Falls in 1848. This group met in the Wesleyan Chapel, where the famous Seneca Falls Convention was also held that year. That autumn, they decided to start a little newspaper to promote temperance to other women in their homes and voted Bloomer and another woman to edit it. Bloomer had been writing columns for temperance papers for a while under pen names, but she didn't have any business or editing experience. But when the temperance committee got cold feet and backed out before the first issue, she refused to quit. She wrote, "Our word had gone to the public, and we had considerable money on subscriptions. Besides the dishonesty of the thing, people would say it was just like women. What more could you expect of them?" She only committed to edit and publish it for 1 year, but it took off quickly, and Bloomer soon developed a network of women writers and editors and readers that had never existed before. She wrote and published articles about temperance, and within a year she had expanded to the social and legal rights of women, as she and her peers realized that without a voice in government, Women could not make themselves heard on temperance or anything else. She made the Lily a key information hub and community for women throughout the state and the nation. She even had an agent in London. It never had a huge circulation, but the right people wrote for it, read it, and depended on it. And I'd just like to say, I think she's an excellent role model for doing things you've never done before. She was a small town woman with a very basic eighth grade education. She and most of her writers had been trained all their lives to be afraid of public exposure, but they were motivated by what they felt to be right. If she didn't know how to do something, like petition the state legislature, she found sympathetic experts to advise her, and she read a lot, and she figured it out as she went along. Anyone can do the same. This is the opening of the first editorial that Bloomer wrote on the subject of women's rights in October 1849, the first year she published The Lily. It reads, "Start not, dear reader, as your eye rests upon the above words, nor think that we are going to nominate either you or ourselves for the governorship or the presidency. No, it is not time to make lady presidents yet, and for ourselves we can say that we have no aspirations of the kind at present, but according to the belief of some, the day will soon come when woman may claim her rights in this respect, and then we may not be backward in taking a seat in the presidential chair, provided the good people shall so will it." So, I have to talk a little about the Bloomers. These are all images I found in a quick search of the word bloomers online. These days, people probably associate it more with underwear, though they've gotten pretty trendy again this past year. And a lot of people don't seem to know that they're named for a person. This is the short dress and matching trousers that Amelia Bloomer wore and promoted. The daguerreotype in the center is of her in 1851, the year that she went viral and was suddenly internationally famous. The photographer was Edward Tompkins Whitney, who would later become known for his Civil War photography. The other two images are woodcuts that she said were accurate of the dress itself. Bloomer never considered dress reform one of her primary causes. She first learned about this new dress from alternative medicine journals. It was described as Turkish dress or the dress of young children. She was chronically ill with severe, almost daily headaches and digestive issues. She'd already given up tight clothing, including corsets, a few years before she put this on. Tight fashions can be fine when you're healthy, but if you aren't, switching to loose clothes can give you some relief. Also, in the 1840s, women's clothing was not just tight, it was heavy, and the hemlines trailed on the ground. This dress and trousers outfit had been worn by white women since the 18th century as a political statement and for exercise and leisure. It was considered a feminine and modest alternative, not too much like the clothes that men wore. It appealed to Bloomer and her friends, and to other women who wore it before they did, for its comfort and freedom. After she had worn it for a few months, she said she'd not been so comfortably dressed since she was a child. You had to be a nonconformist to go out in public like this, but some women only wore it at home, for work. In 1851, when national and international newspapers picked up the pictures that Bloomer published in the Lily and the editorials that she and others wrote about it, they started to call this outfit the Bloomer dress, and the women who wore it bloomers, whose beliefs were bloomerism. Bloomer started to get bags of mail from women thanking her and asking her for patterns. They started to wear it in Ohio and Iowa and Kentucky and Wyoming and California. Women wore it to work in the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. Bloomer balls were thrown in several states. And women would keep wearing it long after the fad was over, most often to do chores or exercise, but a few continued to wear it as a daily dress. It started to be discussed in the big mainstream newspapers as a curiosity, and with some real praise, too. Editors called it graceful and feminine and practical. But if you look at the waistlines in these two images from 1851, they give away that they're not sincere representations of the dress. Both these women look like they're wearing high-fashion corsets. The one on the left is from Harper's, and the article with it doesn't even mention Amelia Bloomer. The one on the right is a Nathaniel Currier plate titled "The Bloomer Costume." Some conventional people were horrified by this from the start, and between the curious and the shocked, the dress stole newspapers. So they kept reprinting the pictures and publishing editorials and letters, and Bloomer got an increasing amount of both fan and hate mail. There were cartoons and songs and stage shows. It was a real craze for a couple of years. Elizabeth Cady Stanton would say it put Seneca Falls on the map. Here's a few more images. This is the sheet music for a Bloomer-themed polka and a waltz. There were so many cartoons, here and overseas. They often show the women smoking, which was considered a Turkish vice. Even the baby is smoking and wearing a fez in the family on the left. And of course, there were a lot of images that focused on the perceived indecency and mannish qualities of women in trousers. This is supposed to be a public boxing match between two bloomers. As a reminder of the real thing, here's a kind of anti-fashion plate that Bloomer published in the Lily in 1852. She says the one that looks most like her is on the right. The one on the left looks more like Elizabeth Smith Miller, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's cousin, who introduced the dress to Seneca Falls. This is what a lot of people called shocking and immodest. The critics said it was indecent and unchristian, and that women who wore it had unsexed themselves. Some of them also made jokes about men wearing petticoats and bonnets and shawls. Bloomer's response to that was that if men felt those things were comfortable and convenient, they should go ahead and wear them. She pledged herself in the Lily to do all in her power to protect you in your right to dress as you please. Bloomer was horrified by a lot of the public attacks on her and the dress, but she also felt defiant and refused to give up her comfortable new dress while she lived in Seneca Falls. She turned down offers to go on stage as a kind of freak show. She stood up to her critics in her paper, and she became very skillful at engaging with political conflict, which served her well as she went on to become a public speaker and serve in state and national organizations. However, the strain of her increasing workload was starting to break down her health even more. She'd become a famous touring speaker while still running the Lily by herself and attending and serving as an officer of the newly founded Women's State Temperance Society of New York State. Her headaches became crippling, and she had to cancel talks, which she hated to do. Her husband Dexter worried about her. And he was also fascinated by the West and excited by the opportunities there. The federal government had legalized the transfer of land warrants of 1850 to anyone who wanted to buy them, and which created a huge market for land speculation. Speculators snapped up the land warrants and resold the land at a profit within a year, often to other speculators. Dexter wanted to join the rush of Easterners moving to the new states to get rich quick. Which brings us at last to Iowa. It's not clear what the conversations were, but Amelia agreed to move west with Dexter, first in 1853 for a year in Ohio, and the next year to Council Bluffs, Iowa. She expressed real grief at leaving her home and friends and family behind, but she was also excited for the move and looked forward to a more restful life in a new and beautiful home. She told the readers of the Lily that we, as a true and faithful wife, are bound to say, in the language of Ruth, "Where thou goest, I will go." Where Dexter wanted to go was the far frontier of the United States. This is a painting of Council Bluffs around the time the Bloomers moved there in 1854, just across the Missouri River from Omaha, in what was then the Nebraska Territory. Native people were still being pushed out of the area. It was founded as a Mormon town, but by the time the Bloomers arrived, most of the Mormons had moved on, and it was considered one of the roughest towns in the West, packed with gambling houses and saloons, including one saloon which was known as the most evil place west of the Mississippi. It was an unfortunate place for a temperance advocate. She didn't leave her fame behind either. When they stopped in St. Joseph, Missouri, to wait for the stagecoach for the last leg of their journey to Council Bluffs, some town officials found out she was in the hotel and asked her to give them a women's rights lecture, which she did. She was the first woman to speak in St. Joseph. 3 days after she arrived in Council Bluffs, a local newspaper announced her arrival and reported that she still pertinaciously adheres to the wearing of the reform costume, which has gained her a worldwide notoriety. When Bloomer moved to Iowa, she had to sell the Lily to a woman in Indiana. There were printing presses in Council Bluffs, but there was no railroad service to distribute it to her subscribers, and there wouldn't be for another 10 years. While visiting Council Bluffs the year before, Dexter had bought a newly built white frame house there at the foot of one of the bluffs with a view of the river. But when they arrived, it turned out the house didn't have finished walls or a kitchen, so they stayed in the Pacific House Hotel for a few months while they waited for their luggage to arrive and for the house to be finished by the seller. This is a picture of that hotel about 20 years later in 1870. When they did move into the house, at first they had to sleep on the floor, since it took months for their belongings to arrive on the riverboat from St. Louis. Dexter's built a kitchen and laundry room onto the back of the house. They planted gardens and trees with cuttings they had brought from New York, most of which didn't survive the heat and the dry weather and the rabbits. When it rained hard, water and mud would run down the bluff and into the kitchen, sometimes into the whole house. There were still many native people in Council Bluffs and traveling through it to the territories. Not long after the Bloomers moved into their new house, a group of Pawnees set up camp on the top of a bluff nearby. They visited the Bloomers often and could speak tolerably fair English, but after about a week, they dropped in to say goodbye and set off west. Bloomer wrote to a friend that there is something interesting to me in these children of nature, and I almost regretted their departure. She wrote that they would see fewer of them from then on, since the government had just paid off the Omaha and moved them on north in Nebraska. They were all collected in Omaha City, she wrote, and from thence started on their journey, accompanied by the Indian agent who was to pay them $20,000 in cash when they reached their destination. The tribe now numbers but 805, counting men, women, and children, and has but 200 men capable of bearing arms. 10 years ago, they numbered 1,600. Their parting from their old home and the graves of their fathers is said by those who witnessed it to have been exceedingly interesting and pathetic. The women and the aged men wept, and the sad-hearted warriors could ill conceal their emotion of tenderness and affection. Dexter got an office downtown and went to work as a land agent, selling newly conquered land to speculators and some settlers. He also sold insurance and speculated a little himself. Amelia bought some land as an investment in her own name, and around this time, she gave up wearing the short dress and trousers. She was said this was partly because she wanted to fit in, and also because hoop skirts came into fashion, which were much lighter and easier to wear than the heavy layers of petticoats had been. She would dress more or less in fashion for the rest of her life. But she did not stop speaking for temperance and women's rights. The Bloomers would welcome church officials, refugees from the Civil War, and traveling speakers into their home, including Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Frederick Douglass. They boarded school teachers, and they adopted 2 Mormon children after their mother died. Amelia was often invited to give lectures in the area, and after a successful one on women's suffrage in Council Bluffs, she received an invitation to give the same talk to the Nebraska legislature across the Missouri River in Omaha, another relatively new town. She had to take a ferry to get there, since there was still no bridge. This is Omaha around that time. She would report that when she arrived, the room and the platform were so packed she hardly had elbow room. She told them that the people rule, and as all the people must be subject to the laws, all should have a voice in their formation. Deny to any class and community the right to be heard at the ballot box, and that class sinks at once into a state of dependence, of civil insignificance, which nothing can save from subjection, oppression, and wrong. The enfranchisement of women will place society upon a higher moral and social elevation than it has ever yet attained. She later reported to the Lily, "I was listened to with the most absorbed interest to the end. Then came great applause." One newspaper reporter who was there called her speech pleasing and logical. Another, from Council Bluffs, wrote that he watched her closely and saw that she was perfectly self-possessed. Not a nerve seemed to be moved by excitement, and the voice did not tremble. She delivered her lecture in a pleasing, able, and we dare say eloquent manner that enchained the attention of her audience for an hour and a half. A man could not have beat it. When the Civil War began, in April 1861, Bloomer helped organize a Soldiers' Aid Society in Council Bluffs to outfit the 7th Iowa Regiment and raised money to make and send hospital supplies down the river to them. For the most part, they sent supplies to the state sanitary agent, Mrs. Annie Wittenmeyer, who had created an unofficial statewide system of aid societies to collect and distribute hospital supplies for the troops. Bloomer very much admired her. But then the state of Iowa created an all-male Iowa Army Sanitary Commission, which attempted to commandeer the women's organization and its resources. Bloomer Society gave in to the pressure to join the state commission and elected Bloomer's assistant as their president. Bloomer sent the remaining funds of the old society to Wittenmeyer and stepped away. But when Wittenmeyer wrote to her directly to ask why they were no longer helping her, Bloomer took her letter to the State Aid Society, which couldn't help because they had no control over their funds. But she was able to organize them in Council Bluffs and appeal through the local paper to collect food instead, and they shipped many boxes of butter and preserves down the river to Wittenmeyer. Bloomer would also support her when the state attempted to discredit her. The Council Bluffs Soldiers' Aid Society regained control of their funds by breaking with the state commission and re-elected Bloomer as their president. As an aside, Bloomer's younger brother August was killed at Gettysburg, along with 80% of his regiment, as part of the Iron Brigade. Dexter's younger friend and law partner, William Kinsman, was also killed in battle, and his personal items were returned to Dexter. Bloomer began to meet new Iowa friends and collaborators, including Annie Savory, a self-educated philanthropist and suffragist in Des Moines who had become one of the first two women to earn a law degree in Iowa. They would work together for women's suffrage in Iowa and came very close to achieving it 50 years before the 19th Amendment. Bloomer served as president of the Iowa Suffrage Association from 1871 to 1873. At that time, Susan B. Anthony and the East Coast women's rights organizations were attempting to create a single national organization, with Anthony at the head of it. Many of the Iowa suffragists resisted this and asserted their independence from Eastern control. But this assertion of independence would not save their movement from a national scandal exposed by Victoria Woodhull, a charismatic Eastern writer and speaker who was the first woman to speak to Congress and the first to run for president of the United States. Woodhull used her newspaper to break the story of an affair between the extremely popular and influential minister Henry Ward Beecher and the wife of his best friend. But Woodhull was already a scandalous figure herself, who promoted the right of women to what was called free love then, which mostly meant the right to end relationships and start new ones when they wanted to, rather than being limited to marriage without divorce. So the scandal almost became more about Woodhull than Beecher. She was a close collaborator with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton for a few years, and the association between them would poison the women's movement when the scandal broke. Still, Iowans, both women and men, would continue to work for women's rights and suffrage until it was achieved in 1920. Here are some of the Western women Amelia Bloomer worked with who are featured in my book. Top, left to right, are Belle Mansfield, Elizabeth Harbert, Frances Gage, and Lizzie Bunnell Reed. Bottom row are Mary Coggeshall, Mary Livermore, Clarina Nichols, and Amelia Bloomer herself. The Bloomers became pillars of the Council Bluffs community, and in the state of Iowa, Dexter had a political career of his own, and they were closely involved with St. Paul's Episcopal Church, the public school which is named for them, and the public library. This is a picture of them in front of their house in Council Bluffs, which they built up over the years until it was a beautiful, comfortable home surrounded by gardens and an orchard. Amelia would often drive that horse and buggy for exercise and fresh air. Bloomer's legacy in Council Bluffs was neglected for decades after her death in 1894. But beginning in the 1970s, people began to take serious interest in her history. They studied her, raised money to clean and repair and update her gravestone in Fairview Cemetery. A mural downtown commemorates her. And in 2022, the school named for her husband changed its name to the Amelia and Dexter C. Bloomer Elementary School and installed a Pomeroy historic marker to honor her and her work. So now I'll read you two passages from the book that feature some Iowa history. In 1854, Council Bluffs had almost 2,000 inhabitants, and new immigrants seemed to arrive every hour with their wagons, cattle, and horses, some to settle, some bound for Nebraska, Utah, or California. The stagecoach lines began to operate daily and ran extra coaches on the road south along the river. There were 3 hotels, but no sidewalks. Most of the new houses were log cabins sided with cottonwood boards, and on the inside walls, instead of plaster, unbleached muslin sewn together and nailed on. Most roads, including the one outside the Bloomers' new home, were beaten paths through fields of sunflowers. A Mr. and Mrs. Officer soon moved into the frame house next door. A log house was built just below them, and Indians frequently pitched their tents and camped there for days together. The little valley between the bluffs contained Broadway, the only street. The new people were mostly transplanted Easterners like themselves. Bloomer described the men as shrewd, intelligent, and energetic, ride in fine carriages and drive fast horses and understand how to drive a good bargain in corner lots and bottomlands, as well as in the various kinds of business in which they are engaged. I cannot say much for the morals of some of them, but since I see that horse races and billiard rooms are well patronized, the latter being licensed by the authorities. Generally speaking, however, we have a quiet, well-ordered community. The women make about the same personal display here as elsewhere and occupy themselves pretty much after the fashion of women of other places. The houses and furniture are generally simple and unpretending, and in that respect little opportunity is afforded for the gratification of their ambition to make a fine appearance, one room frequently answering the purpose of parlor, sitting room, sleeping room, and kitchen. There are many, however, who live in much better style, and soon the simple dwellings of furniture of others will give place to more substantial and imposing structures, and more showy and costly adornings. I have met some ladies who are intelligent and well educated and accustomed to good society, but I think there is less sociability here than any place I've known. This is probably owing to the unsettled state of society and the constant coming in of strangers. Time will doubtless work a change for the better in this respect. One evening, with Dexter out at a railroad planning meeting, Bloomer sat at their one table and wrote a letter to the Lily, with a lamp lit and the front door open to the transformed prairie view. The tall, dry grass of last year's growth on this land is on fire, for about half a mile in extent, and the flames, sweeping off toward the river, are devouring everything in their path. From my open door as I sit writing, I have the scene full before me. The whole country round is illuminated by the bright flames, which dance and crackle as they sweep on their course, while the columns of white smoke, rising high in the heavens, set off by the dark horizon which forms the background beyond, add greatly to the beauty of the scene. It is truly a magnificent spectacle, and I would that some of our Eastern friends were here to enjoy it with me. Such sights are so common here that people think but little of them. About 15 years later, in January 1870, Democrats in the Iowa legislature took up the now popular tactic of forcing debate on women's suffrage to embarrass and distract the Republicans. They proposed a state suffrage amendment for Iowa. The Republicans called their bluff and created a committee to investigate it. Henry Blackwell, an abolitionist and women's rights activist in the East, wrote to Annie Savary in Des Moines about forming a women's association for Iowa. But she told him she would not dare without the advice and instruction of a competent leader. She wrote to Amelia Bloomer that you certainly have the experience and ability. If Bloomer's health was an obstacle, she said, Savary was willing to be her student. But Bloomer was too sick even to visit her. Bloomer's old collaborators, Lucy Stone and Mary Livermore, launched a new women's rights newspaper in Boston called the Woman's Journal with a mission statement that echoed the familiar old slogan of the Lily, devoted to the interests of women. Bloomer told Stone about the germinating movement in Iowa and the proposed amendment. Savary offered to visit Bloomer and bring her back to Des Moines to meet with her legislative friends. Bloomer wrote to her and outlined all that would have to be done to organize the women of the state. It was not the work of a month. They gradually decided it made sense to prepare for the next general session of the state legislature, which would be in 2 years. Women's suffrage supporters around Iowa began to write to Bloomer. A married couple introduced themselves by letter so that we will be in communication and ready to work when the canvassing begins. We know of no one else in this state prominent in this cause to whom we may write. One woman in Decatur County wrote a letter that could have been from a woman 20 years earlier in New York. They had heard but very little about the women's suffrage movement. A few of us are trying to organize a women's club, not under the name of women's rights, however. We want to discuss various topics so that we may learn to express our opinions publicly, as men do. Bloomer finally made her first trip to Des Moines to stay with Annie Savory in March 1870. She found her a true kindred spirit, enthusiastic and kind and sharp-witted, a small, elegant woman with black hair, a high forehead, and large, expressive eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. On the afternoon of March 29th, they sat with a crowd of other women in the House to watch the debate of a motion to allow them to vote and hold office in Iowa. Bloomer's expectations were low. But to her astonishment, after strong speeches by old supporters and recent converts, it carried 52 to 32. The crowd broke into applause and cheers. The next day, everyone packed into the Iowa Senate. The woman who reported the House action was greeted by the senators with a standing ovation. They remained on their feet while she read it, applauded when she finished, suspended the rules, and took immediate action. All attempts at a debate were choked off, wrote Bloomer, and the measure was approved on a roll call vote of 32 to 11. Once again, the audience cheered. Bloomer was floored, and then she was elated. All the effort invested by the abolitionist and women's movements for decades had finally put forth this flower, like an apple tree that took years to mature. No current women's organization in Iowa had lifted a finger. It seemed possible that the next General Assembly would approve the amendment a second time, as required by law, and submit it to state referendum for ratification. She and Savory struggled through the crowd to shake hands with some of the supporting legislators and thank them. The next day, Savory hosted a meeting in her parlors to discuss a plan for the state women's suffrage organization. The atmosphere was joyous, grateful, and earnest, but it was not clear who the leaders would be. Bloomer was a popular choice, but she could not promise more than some writing and occasional meetings and lectures near her home. Bloomer returned to Council Bluffs, welcomed her sister Elvira for a visit, and wrote to Lucy Stone about Iowa for the Women's Journal. We have much to do to enlighten the people. No field is now more inviting. No other gives greater promise of success. Stone placed her letter on the front page. A few years later, the Bloomers would host the journalist and speaker Hannah Tracy Cutler, who wrote to Lucy Stone, where I called on to say in what state I find the truest fitness for the reception of women into political relations, I should say Iowa. If Iowa shall first give suffrage to women, we will all vote to make her the capital state and locate our national center at Council Bluffs. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for being here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We've got plenty of time here for questions. So as a reminder to those of you who are in the audience, we've got a Q&A feature here at the bottom. And so please submit your questions there, and we will get to as many of them as we can. We will get started here in just a second. So feel free to put those in that Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as we can. The first one I have here that came through is, how did Bloomer stack up against her contemporaries like Stanton or Susan B. Anthony? And I think by stack up, perhaps the question is, those two names are very prominent. And I think unless you're from Iowa, Bloomer is not as well known. Like they are in those two are just such big names. So how did she fit in? Looking, they're about the same age. They grew up in the same place. She just moved to Iowa. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how she relates to some of those really leading lights nationwide, especially after her move to Iowa.
Yes. So Bloomer lived in Seneca Falls, and Stanton moved there afterwards, a few years afterwards, with her family. And at that point, Stanton was really trapped at home with her very small children. Her husband traveled a lot. Um, and so she's began to write for the Lily. And if you read the Lily at that time, Stanton was not really a better writer than several other women who were writing for it at that time, or Bloomer. But Stanton had what Bloomer did not. She did have significant connections and money behind her. So she had the ability to get the word out and promote her work in a way that Bloomer didn't to people in Boston and in the abolitionist community. Her husband was a very famous abolitionist speaker as well. So once she was able to get more off the ground, she had more connections to draw on. Susan B. Anthony took a while to come around to women's rights. Bloomer introduced her to Stanton in Seneca Falls when Anthony had she had gotten to know Anthony through temperance at other conventions, and then Anthony followed a couple of speakers down to Seneca Falls to see them again, and Bloomer introduced Stanton and Anthony there, and then they got together the next morning to make plans together. So that's where their friendship started. Bloomer was really sort of a hub, an information hub for a lot of women at that time. She and the Lily just connected a lot of people. Um, so also Bloomer was chronically ill, and that was a lot of what limited her ultimately. She had a public speaking career that was taking off at the same time as Stanton and Anthony's, but she just couldn't keep up. She was too sick, and I think part of the reason that Dexter wanted to move her away from where the railroads would reach was to get her away from all the conventions and meetings and speaking engagements. So, but once she was in Council Bluffs, Anthony and Stanton relied on her quite a lot, and that's in the book. They would come out and visit her, stay with her. She would set up speaking engagements for them. So they were still in communication. And when Stanton and Anthony were trying to influence Iowa politics and also in Kansas and other Western states, um, they would often call on Bloomer. And they also called on her to help them write especially the Iowa chapter for their history of women suffrage, which all that information is in the book.
Perfect. Yeah, it's fascinating and really helpful, I think, to hear about the connections and the money behind some of these women because it might, you might think, oh, she moved away from the center and that's what did it. But, in what you're describing is actually it's a much more complex story of money and influence and connections and marriage that helps us understand why people like Stanton have the stature that they do over some others. Super interesting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about you mentioned very briefly, this says, you mentioned that Bloomer bought land in her own name in Council Bluffs. This question was that unique at the time for a woman to own land, or was that more common? Um, yeah.
Um, yeah, it wasn't unique in Iowa. There's more about this in the book again, but she had a friend, Frances Gage, who was older than she was, who moved to Iowa before she did, and who wrote to her saying, "It's beautiful here, it's wonderful, women can own property." So that was something of a draw for her. But for instance, in Ohio, women didn't have any property rights, and they did by the time Bloomer moved to Iowa, they did in New York. So yeah, no, it was actually a draw. There were a couple of cases that I read of where a woman and her daughter, for example, her grown daughter, had moved to Iowa to buy a farm because they could there. Um, so yeah, it was an option in Iowa at that time when it wasn't in some other states.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, my my ancestors came in the 1860s in Northwest Iowa, and I know that one of my great 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 grandmothers owned, she also was a part of the homestead claim in the 60s, along with her husband, and but her name's on the original land deeds, and so but that was probably 10 years later. So,
Yeah.
anyway, um, I wonder. This next question is. Maybe wanting to hear a little bit more about how Bloomer related to the Iowa suffrage movement and that how the geography of her place was in Western Iowa affected that. So she was all the way in Council Bluffs, and I don't know, for your sake, a lot of times in Iowa history, Eastern Iowa, Central Iowa are seen as the hubs, but she's in Council Bluffs, which was on the far west. And so did that have anything to do or any effect on her role and what she did? You talked a little bit about at the end, but don't know if you want to or are able to expand on that at all.
Yeah, initially it was a bit of a problem because she was not well enough. Taking a stagecoach somewhere was hard work. It was very bruising and yeah, she wasn't able to travel very much in the first 10 years she lived there. Um, Later on, when they started, after the war, basically, when they started to really get the movement off the ground, there were some meetings that were held in the southeast, and of course, place names tend to drop out of my head, but it is in the book. The initial meeting of the Women's Suffrage Society for Iowa was held in a southeastern town. They tried to have most of them in Des Moines to be more central, and that's where Savory lived as well. And of course, the legislature was meeting. So a lot focused on that, and a lot of the later scandal that happened too also focused on the group that was there. Um, so yeah, it did limit her to some extent, but she also kind of wanted to be limited because she wasn't actually physically up to doing as much as people wanted her to. She was sort of the obvious celebrity to take over. She had the skills, she knew how to organize and all of that sort of thing, but she just, yeah, she just didn't have the strength to be the number one person. That said, she did get elected to be president for a few years in a row. Um, but yeah, when the scandal hit, she became kind of a negative focus, and so she stepped back for a little while. But she would still advise people, and she would still respond to letters from younger women for mentorship and that sort of thing.
Super helpful. Yeah, thank you. And full disclosure, I am from far western Iowa, north
Okay.
of Council Bluffs. So like this, I'm always interested. These kind of questions are interesting to me. Um, so a question I have, full disclosure, this is my question, but I'm curious about um, maybe her perspective on women's suffrage, uh, and how that was affected by her maybe Western facing position, from Council Bluffs. I'm thinking about like Wyoming, Utah, some of the very first places to pass woman suffrage were in the West. And in a lot of ways, Council Bluffs is going to have a more Western flavor than other parts of Iowa, because it's right there on the west looking out to the Great Plains. And so do you get a sense of that at all? Does she, you mentioned earlier she had special insight into, or she was writing about Kansas and other Great Plains states. Does she have a different experience of a woman suffrage because she's positioned in this place that's closer to the Great Plains and the Mountain West, where women do have early successes?
Yeah, I mean well, it's partly reflected in that section of the book that I read at the last. There were some people who really thought that it would happen in the West before it happened for the whole country. And to some degree it kind of did. There were also, well, there was also this whole Anthony wanted to focus on the federal amendment. Lucy Stone and some others, including a lot of the Westerners, wanted to do a incremental approach where you would win. You could vote. Well, in a lot of places, women could vote for school board before they could vote for anything else. So to sort of, get local suffrage and then state suffrage and move up from there. Um, but yeah, there were a lot of very powerful organizers and speakers in the West who were accomplishing quite a lot. And if it hadn't been for the Woodhull scandal, I think they probably would have accomplished more. They were I think that Anthony and Stanton, okay, so Bloomer was also she was a very devoted Christian. And I think she understood the perspective a lot of average women, both in the East and the West, a bit more than, say, Elizabeth Cady Stanton did. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a flaming radical, and she was very anti-Bible, very anti-organized religion. And she just, it's good to have people, I think, with movements for change who are on the extreme cutting edge, but they don't always, get what the people in the middle or lagging a little further behind are, what their perspectives are. And Bloomer did understand that. She understood, how people needed to be brought along. So yeah, I think I've lost track of the question.
Oh no, that's super helpful. I think you kind of got to some of that question about what she might have been able to see,
Okay.
because she was positioned closer to that where there were those incremental early successes. So another question that came in from the audience is, what kind of chronic illnesses did she have that kept her with those lower levels? Do we know? What other than some of the general descriptions that you provided?
Yeah, she talks a bit about her symptoms at various times. And I know that she had a very severe case of what was almost certainly malaria right after she got married. And the most common treatment for significant illness at that time was mercury. It was a compound of mercury that they would give you until you started to show serious signs of poisoning, like salivating, your teeth would loosen, you could have neurological and organ damage, which would all be kind of lasting effects. And she talked later on about having her teeth had gotten loose and she was thinking about having them all out, which wasn't so uncommon back then. Um, so my best guess is that she had a bad case of malaria, which may or may not even have been cured. And the treatments that she had, because she would talk about my drug rattled constitution. Um, that was why she ended up turning to alternative medicine, water cures, diet and exercise, that sort of thing. And that was, those were the journals that introduced her to this alternative dress as well.
Super. Well, we've got time, I think, for maybe one more question. And I want to ask you kind of a big picture question. You've given us a great sense of Bloomer's life and her contribution. What would you say for those who are listening, for those who listen later? What's the main thing or the couple main things that you would like people to take away from this project and this story? What are the headlines that people should say, yeah, we remember this about her? I know you've got a title and a subtitle, so I might guess where this is going, but yeah, what are the big takeaways that you want people to walk away with?
Well, one of them is that this outfit was the last thing she wanted to be remembered for. She spent so much time and energy in her later life trying to set the record straight on the fact that she had been a women's rights and temperance advocate. She was not a dress reform person. So that's a big one that I think she would smack me if I didn't say. Um, um, the other is that when you are trying to change the world, you don't need to, the best thing I would say is not to focus on winning. Bloomer didn't win hardly anything, but she laid an enormous amount of foundation and she mentored a lot of the next generation. A lot of the arguments that go on in the Lily and the language that they go on in, it's amazing how similar they are to the arguments that happen today. Often, yeah, just in the same words often. I think it's really important to read history of these movements so that you know when you're making a new argument and when somebody's trying to make you argue something that was settled in the 1850s.
That's excellent. Interesting. And I love that point about how she lost a lot, like because she did, she did, but that didn't mean that her work wasn't valuable. It didn't build a foundation, even though there wasn't a lot of winning um, in her season. So great. That's a really inspiring and thoughtful way to end things. That does bring us to a close. I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and especially want to give a big thank you to Sara Catterall for being here and joining us. We hope that everyone will sign up for Iowa History 101 webinars that take place throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. And if you're looking to learn more Iowa history, you can find and watch over 120 recorded webinars from past 101 programs on the Iowa History YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you virtually for the next Iowa History 101 on December 11th. The topic will be Sand and Silence, the art of Andrew Clemens of McGregor, Iowa. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.